All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I know everyone's very busy, so I really appreciate the time you've made to join our town hall. I hope the fall quarter is going well for everyone. And as we've said in different spaces, it's exciting to have all of us back together on campus in this way. So we'll be spending the next 50 minutes or so discussing the findings of our climate assessment report. And before we move forward, I just wanted to share a few reminders. We are recording the town hall and we'll be sharing it through our UCLA Arts Weekly email. So please be on the lookout for that. We will also have a Q&A portion near the end. We'll try to address as many of the questions you all submit, but if we don't cover it during this town hall, we'll be sure to answer it in a different format later on. The hour here today will include a presentation by Dr. Charles Davis, a discussion with members of the Dean's executive team, and as I mentioned, a Q&A with you all. And so we're meeting today, as I mentioned, to present the findings of our school-wide climate assessment and have a discussion with our school community. I'm thankful for everyone making time to attend. Also thankful to our dean for his ongoing support of our collective work here as a school. For those that joined the school this past year, you may not have seen the work that has taken place the past couple years. So just want to give a brief recap of how we got to this moment. So our work started roughly in the spring of 2020 with the formation of our Anti-Racism, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Commission. The commission had members of our school-wide community, including students, faculty, and staff. Their work created our initial strategic planning document, which was shared in our initial invitation for this town hall. Part of our goals also was to conduct a climate assessment, focusing on the educational climate and also the workplace climate. And the climate assessment commenced in February of 21. We took a brief pause after getting a lot of feedback from our student population and also our faculty and staff that, we were still in the midst of COVID. There was a lot going on in our community. And in order to do the data collection, we needed to take a meaningful pause and then and regroup later on. And so we brought the study back up in fall. We completed the study around this past spring. Dr. Davis and his team analyzed the findings, analyzed the data, and presented the findings in a complete report that we shared with everyone. And so that's how we got to the moment here today. And so I'd like to introduce Dr. Charles Davis. For those who are not familiar with him. Dr. Davis is currently an assistant professor in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education at the University of Michigan. His research and teaching broadly focuses on issues of race, racism, and resistance in education and society. He is also the founder and director of the Campus Abolition Research Lab. This is an interdisciplinary research incubator focusing on leveraging data and critical analyses to disrupt and dismantle the carceral university while collaboratively reimagining post-secondary education as a life-affirming institution. In addition, Charles is an organizational strategist, and he helped launch 2 national racial equity research centers, one at the University of Pennsylvania and the other at the University of Southern California. In those leadership roles, he provided assessment and evaluation, strategic consultation, and professional and organizational learning to more than 7,000 students, educators, and institutional leaders from more than 100 colleges and universities. And so I'm really grateful for Charles's partnership throughout this entire process, and really thank him and his team for their support with this report. So with that said, I'm happy to hand it over to Dr. Davis.
Thanks so much, Mike. And it's a pleasure to be in the company of my colleagues here at the School of Art and Architecture. It's really been a tremendous pleasure to work with you all over the last couple of years. So I'm just very thankful for the opportunity to address you and to talk a bit about our findings, which you can find in greater detail in the full report that was shared. So at this time, I'll just share my screen here. Just to make sure that everyone can see our slides. All right.
We don't see the slides.
Oh, you don't. You probably see my desktop.
Yeah, desktop. Yeah.
Let's see if this will work.
Yep, there we go.
Okay, slides are showing now.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so to get us started, I just want to talk about the methodology briefly. It's often important to understand how we came to the set of conclusions and the process by which we engaged with the various stakeholders at the School of Art and Architecture. So to start off with our data collection procedures, so as many of you know and others are learning, we administered a pair of surveys, one of which was geared towards faculty and staff to understand workplace experiences and perceptions therein, as well as to separate survey for students, both undergraduate and graduate. And those were distributed via email to all of the UCLA Arts students, faculty, and staff. And it was administered over a 3-week period in January of 2022. As Michael mentioned, we had a pause from our initial administration in the spring of 2021 and restarted that process in January of 2022. The survey was organized primarily into 6 blocks, which we find to be important of understanding experiences and perceptions of workplace and school climate, to include the demographic information of the respondents of those surveys, their self-appraisals of their own commitments to anti-racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion, school and workplace experiences, perceptions of community and sense of belonging, appraisals of the organization's commitment to AEDI, and 6 experiences of harassment, discrimination, as well as incident reporting. Very broadly, and there are again a number of more nuanced understandings of the demographics presented in the report, just so you can have a snapshot of those who presented were respondents in the survey. For our faculty and staff survey, we had about 61% of the respondents identify as staff, 7% as administrators or those with senior level and managerial responsibilities, and then 32% of respondents were faculty across our non-tenure track and tenure track designations. With regard to students, it was about a 50-50 split, with 49% of student respondents identifying as undergraduates and 51% identifying as graduate students. In total, we had about 138 respondents on the faculty and staff survey and 167 unique respondents for the student survey. What's important to understand with the student numbers is that, again, we began our initial administration in the spring of 2021. And so there were some students, many of whom may have graduated by 2022 or were not able to respond to be accounted for. And so what we did in an attempt to reconcile those 2 groups was to use unique identifiers of IP addresses to reconcile those who may have taken the survey twice, and to be able to remove and identify the unique respondents to ensure that there weren't duplicates that may have adjusted some of the numbers that have been reported inside the report. In terms of our data collection for focus groups, so we started with the initial administration of the survey that then led into 25 supplementary focus groups to both expound upon what we understood to be some of the preliminary findings of the survey, but also to allow for others to give more voice and provide more nuance to what it is that we did not necessarily understand about their perceptions and experiences. This was took place in April of 2022, shortly after the close of the survey, with various groups of students, staff, and faculty, which you can see in Table 1 here to the right. And ultimately, those were consolidated to 14 groups from the initial 25, in part based on what we saw and observed with our signups, regard to 75 total participants. What also ended up happening with those sessions is that they were less attended than we expected. And so we had many folks who volunteered, but many of whom were not able to show up for reasons that were not necessarily clear to our team. And so we were able to still facilitate the sessions you see here on the right with the participants that were able to contribute, many of whom had already been engaged in some aspect of the AEDI work at the school. And so we felt that many of those participants had sort of key insights and perspectives that were also ultimately going to be useful, although not quite as broad as we would have liked in the overall participation. So that being said, we can understand that what was found as a result of the study might be understood through a certain limitation that it obviously does not speak to everyone's individual experience, but more importantly speaks to some themes that we could draw across, not just the focus group conversations, but in juxtaposing those with the key findings from the surveys itself. Now onto our key findings. And again, these will be spoken about at a higher level. There's more nuance and detail again included in the report, which I encourage everyone to read if they have not had a chance to do so. So 6 key findings from our faculty and staff survey. The first of which is that many faculty respondents felt that the composition of their departments did reflect a meaningful racial and ethnic diversity, but not necessarily gender diversity. And of course, we can look at the broader numbers of college university faculty, which tends to be predominated by men, and that to be something that was mirrored in the way that respondents were discussing how they assessed gender diversity within the departments, although again, recognizing what they believe to be meaningful racial and ethnic diversity. Both faculty and staff respondents felt that their unit or department was generally committed to AEDI in practice. Third, respondents felt confident in their own individual abilities to engage in conversations about, as well as be supported in their development related to AEDI issues. Fourth, respondents reported engaging with colleagues across identity differences in both professional and social settings, this cueing to how we understand what we call interactions across difference. Fifth, respondents indicated having a strong sense of community and belonging while also feeling safe from psychological and physical harm. Sixth and finally, 1/3 of faculty and staff respondents indicated having experienced an incident of harassment or discrimination, half of which also reported the incident, but most commonly to a supervisor or a department chair, not necessarily to official response bias reporting systems. Moving on to student survey findings. Student respondents mostly reported a perception that faculty were committed to inclusive teaching practices and preparing students for success in a diverse society. Second, respondents reported voluntarily collaborating with a diverse group of peers and socially interacting across categories of difference, specifically within their identity groups. Third, student respondents generally reported not experiencing microaggressions and micro-invalidations in their classroom experiences. Fourth, respondents mostly reported feeling psychologically, emotionally, and physically safe in classroom environments. 5, student respondents perceived a positive sense of belonging and community within their respective academic departments. 6, respondents overwhelmingly believe that faculty, administrators, and students from majoritarian identity groups should be most responsible for creating an inclusive school climate, not students from underrepresented or minoritized identity groups. 7th, and finally, students indicated a strong perception of the school's general commitment to AEDI, but were unsure of how the school's commitment to meaningfully address issues of harassment and discrimination exists as they arose. With regard to our focus group findings, there were 6 thematic findings, again, looking at patterns across the conversations with multiple stakeholder groups. The first being a bureaucratic delay of communication and AEDI progress. Now, part of that was simply to suggest that although there was well known that work had been taking place within the school, that there were some lack of clarity about where and how that work was progressing beyond the initial work that was going on with the commission. And part of that was attributed to a larger sort of bureaucratic delay that took place at the university level with regard to issues of AEDI, but also some logs and internal communication systems that prevented AEDI progress to be communicated more consistently and transparently in lieu of many other communications commitments in the absence of a position that would be solely dedicated to addressing AEDI concerns. 2, COVID-19 and work from home as a refuge. This theme was reported to us based on many folks who shared that the opportunity to work from home, albeit under the context of the pandemic, also provided a sense of refuge in that there were many workplace experiences, whether they be of harassment or discrimination or incidents of bias that were not able to take place in the same ways that they had been in the workplace for folks. And so home really provided a level of insulation from common workplace occurrences that often took place when folks were still meeting in person. Third, the diversity rhetoric versus the results. Customary to many organizations, the school not being an exempt, that much of the rhetoric, particularly that which came after the moments of 2020's reckoning, showed that results often lag behind the rhetoric and the commitments that were espoused by a number of organizations. And this seemed to be also true in many regards with some of the perceptions amongst staff and students within the school. Fourth, an inadequate support for the advancement of minoritized professionals. This was recognized based on what is relatively low levels of trajectory for many employees within the school, again, not very dissimilar from that of the university, in that most of the minoritized professionals consistently communicated that they were unsure about what opportunities would exist beyond their specific and current roles, specifically how they might also be able to transition and be prepared for leadership within the school's context. Fifth, leadership staff hierarchy, taxation, and the diversity divide. This particular theme sort of recognized that there was, of course, a hierarchy between senior level administrators and those with managerial capacities, and those who were either entry level or in roles that's reported to supervisors. But part of this yielded an understanding that much of leadership was not necessarily reflective of the diversity of the entire school, in which minoritized professionals tended to occupy roles that were supervised and or entry level, but also that these same professionals and students as well were often the ones who were engaging in the predomination of the diversity work. And so that caused a certain taxation that went without a level of recognition, as well as compensation formally and informally for the labor that was committed to AEDI efforts. And some of that may have been reflected of work, not just in the commission, but also other informal AEDI work that took place at an interpersonal level or within individual units. Sixth and last, self-directed community and interactions across difference. So consistent with what we heard respondents share in the survey, as well as in our focus groups, is that much of the interaction across difference and the ability to establish community was self-directed. It was things that individuals would have to take on, or even collective folks of individuals would have to take on, and creating those sort of communities for themselves, creating a sense of belonging and to be able to interact with one another that wasn't necessarily directly facilitated by any particular programs or initiatives that had otherwise been established at the school. So in thinking about these particular findings, we were able to develop a subset of recommendations that we think will begin to assist areas of improvement as a result of what we found in our assessment. The first is to conduct an audit and improve internal processes for communicating AEDI progress. For us, this meant, one, assessing both the staffing and the resource needs that would support regular communication for AEDI progress. This would work across multiple units to include the communications unit, as well as those who would be supporting the new executive director for AEDI in ways that would ensure that regular communication of what's happening related to AEDI issues and concerns and programs and initiatives could be communicated in a timely and transparent fashion. Secondly, we encourage the school to develop professional learning opportunities that will improve AEDI advocacy. In part, we wanted to think about opportunities that would remediate bystander behavior and encourage advocacy and intervention. What was commonly reported with instances of harassment and discrimination is that those who had witnessed rather than experienced were more likely to report an instance that they had witnessed, although again, not necessarily to the formalized structures. And in thinking about that, the question remained of what opportunities would there be for those who are bystanders or witnesses to this particular type of instance, have the ability to engage in advocacy ethically, as well as to engage in certain levels of intervention rather than having to simply observe and report, rather than be able to intervene. Third, to improve senior level search and hiring practices to address diverse leadership gap. So returning to this idea of the leadership staff hierarchy, but also the extent to which minoritized professionals have not been fully represented in the leadership of the school and its individual units, was to develop procedural guidelines that would promote the recruitment of managers, directors, administrative deans, and other senior staff from underrepresented and minoritized groups. We think about this a lot as a condition of how faculty searches may be run and also governed by a particular set of policies or procedures that often elude our ability to transfer those same sorts of practices or understandings into our staff and administrative hiring processes. Fourth, to review and revise school level incident reporting processes and resources. So in thinking about this, we want to encourage a review of the existing processes that would illuminate opportunities for the school to better support victims and survivors, as well as facilitate resolution at the university level. So that is, given that there is a larger structure within which the school operates, it has its own policies and procedures for bias and harassment discrimination reporting, thinking about what intentional ways can the school also develop internal processes that would better support and facilitate, rather than simply hand off individuals who have these experiences, and to help them feel more empowered by navigating that experience as a collective rather than doing so alone. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks and transition back to our colleagues.
All right. Thank you, Charles, for the in-depth presentation of the report and the findings. We're going to transition now, and I'd like to invite our panelists on the screen as well. We're going to spend the next 20 minutes or so engaging in a discussion of the report and specifically on the recommendations and some of our initial thoughts here in the Dean's office on work we've been engaging in up to now, work we plan to continue working on, and then we'll transition over to a Q&A opportunity for those in attendance here today. So as we dive into the recommendations, as Charles shared with his last slide, I just want to again recognize the time and effort everyone provided over the past couple of years with all of our work, starting again, as we mentioned, the commission's work and leading into also our climate assessment. It was an extraordinary time for our school in many ways, and the way we were all able to rally together and engage in this climate assessment, I really am grateful for our community and our investment in the future of our school. So thank you for that. So with our panelists here, and for those that may not know everyone on the screen, can we just go around really quickly and introduce yourself, who you are and your role at the school, and then I'll bring us over to the first question topic.
I'll start. Anne-Marie Burke, I'm the Executive Director of Strategic Communications.
I'll go next. I'm Lionel Popkin. I'm a professor of choreography in the Department of World Arts and Cultures and the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs here in the School of Arts and Architecture, and I'll hand it over to Anya.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Anya Booker. I'm the Associate Dean and Executive Director for Anti-Racism, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the School of Arts and Architecture, and thrilled to be joining you today.
And I'm Chantel Daniels. I'm the Director of Student Services for the school.
Thank you. And hi, everybody. I'm Brett Steele, Dean of the School of the Arts and Architecture, a professor of architecture. And let me first just say thank you all again for taking time, busy time of the quarter and year, of course, for carving out a bit of time for this town hall, which is an important next step in work that's been going on for some time in the school. Part of what we've tried to plan in this is to provide a bit of background to how we've arrived to where we have here. Charles, thank you so much for the summary of findings and recommendations, which we can discuss now a little bit before taking questions, and Michael for the setup and the background on that. And a first point I would just like to share with everybody who wasn't a part of the work to this point is just that we really believed deeply in not just our larger commitment and belief in how we can advance work around AEDI in all of its forms across the school, but that in a school like ours that is as dispersed as we are, geographically and physically across a dozen different buildings in not just the academic side of the house, but also our public units, that it was I think one of the key findings that Charles mentioned and the shared commitment that can be found across all of our units to do this work around AEDI has played just a really powerful role as a driver in the strategic thinking we're doing more broadly across the school. And that was exactly the reasoning that led to my calling together a commission that could represent all levels of experience and all of the different kinds of stakeholders in the school to come together to really approach the topic of strategic planning, and I think a really innovative and important way in a campus like ours, i.e. to involve everyone literally in a bottom-up effort to first identify strengths and weaknesses across the school as we currently are, to really acknowledge some of our limitations and weaknesses to this point, but to also creatively draw on the experience from all of you that have been a part of the process to this point. So I'm just going to pause there in terms of a preamble to set up this discussion, and I'll turn it over to colleagues to see if there are any immediate thoughts, particularly around the 4 recommendations for how it is we're going to be carrying this work forward, and look forward to the feedback and ideas that all of you can provide.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you, everyone. And so I'd like to focus our discussion on the first recommendation, which is an audit and improvement of internal processes for communicating AEDI progress. And where we are currently, what we've been working on as a school, as a dean's office, where we see ourselves headed as it relates to this topic. And anyone who'd like to start off, please.
I'll start that one off. And Anya, I hope you'll share this space with me on this one. I think the next phase of our strategic planning is going to be an important part of that, or how we communicate generally, but specifically around this will be an important part of that process and that conversation, and how we quite literally weave that into a strategic plan going forward, I think is essential. And then, Anya and I have already begun the conversations about how we can better use the tools and platforms that we have in terms of communications, our website, our ongoing weekly and monthly email communications we send out, our social media channels, etc., and possibly even ones we have not yet, launched, to more regularly and more transparently be communicating about AEDI. And that communication, from my perspective, is not only about reporting what we're doing in terms of progress on this work, but it is also about the content that we're sharing, and what we're paying attention to, and what stories we're telling, and how we're broadening that lens and making sure that we're living that commitment through the stories we're telling. I think some of that work's already started, but we certainly have more to do. Anya, do you want to say more?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I first want to just take a beat and echo the gratitude. I, of course, am entering this conversation at a different stage. You all have done, in my estimation, some phenomenal work in getting us to this conversation. And I think that's important to acknowledge. And I'm grateful for the assessment. I'm grateful for the ways that we are already thinking about how to tie the assessment to the strategic planning, to continued conversations. So in this topic around communication, I think Lionel said it best a few days ago. There's the informal ways that we'll continue to communicate in structures and meetings that already exist. For instance, with the FEC, with chairs, with the public units, et cetera. But there's also a real emphasis in thinking about what are some of the other ways that communication can be illuminated. And so more on that will come. I think one of the first stages and places that's compelling is that we are, of course, looking to how do we move from the commission to a new council. So know that conversation has already begun, and that we're ready to explore how that council can be composed, take shape, and get to work. And we'll think about ways that, for instance, all of the the report as a whole will be held and taken into consideration. I don't know about how all of you all feel with the report, but I would imagine there are more thoughts and things that you would like to say about it. So I will also structure ways for us to have conversation about exploring the report together, learning from it, and thinking of it as it's living, breathing, like the commission was living and breathing. We need to still go forward with what we're learning from what was shared. And most importantly, as we're moving forward, thinking about what are the actionable steps, things that we will do based on the recommendations, based on the need for, building on this really transformative moment. So what are the things that we will do collectively? And there's, of course, much more that we can say about that, but just know that the communication, and particularly the collaborative leadership and communication, I think is our collective superpower. I think that this is where we have the greatest opportunity to advance this quite meaningful work.
And thank you both. And before we move on to the next a recommendation, I think, one of the takeaways is really building on the engagement we've had and are continuing to deepen with our student council, our FEC, with the broader staff, and work on ways to collaborate in different ways to address how we are making progress on the goals we've outlined, short, mid, and long-term goals in the AEDI strategic plan. And as Anne-Marie mentioned, we'll be announcing the next phase of our work very soon as well. And we're very excited to engage in that work, and we'll be sharing that with you all in the weeks ahead. So, there are other aspects, obviously, with resource allocation that's going to be critical in doing that work, and we're looking at those carefully as well, because it impacts so many different areas of our school. So the next recommendation is developing professional learning opportunities to improve AEDI advocacy. And anyone who would like to speak on that one, please.
I would like to add something. So one of the things that clearly came out of the commission's work together was the reconceiving of this role, right? And what would be involved, what are the responsibilities involved? And though the equity advisor was a responsibility that existed previously, know that it's continuing. Perhaps one of the things that's changing is how the equity advisors on a campus-wide basis are making some difference and moves together. And one of those is in this particular area. In our most recent meeting of the council, there was discussion about areas from across the campus that are EDI related and what folks wanted to work on. And this topic is much like the work has happened around faculty hiring and that process, and a specific set of steps that include EDI efforts and attention. There's also this consideration of how those kinds of things can operate for the campus. And so what's important about that is that it naturally I'll be engaged in that conversation, learning from that conversation, and we will bring that conversation to the way that we're thinking about operating with those opportunities here in the school. And I think Michael in particular, or whoever wants to share at the moment, can speak to how some of that effort, some of those efforts have already been made. So we're already, the train is already leaving the station, so to speak. We're already doing some of it.
Yeah, and we've learned quite a bit from our past experiences. We worked with organizations like Art Equity as well, and People's Institute, and training is a hot topic, but we also want to focus on resources, as the recommendation outlines, professional learning opportunities. So it doesn't have to always be a training, but what are the ways in which our community, what resources does our community need to continue this work, right? And what are a series of dialogue opportunities that might be useful? Where can we get those necessary resources from campus, as Anya mentioned, as an equity advisor, and in our respective roles as we engage with our colleagues across campus, whether it's academic, student, or administration, or strategic communications. Those are all interrelated in many ways in terms of our advancing the work. So I think there will be more to share there in opportunities, and I think the important thing to note here, I mean, there's been a lot of responses here so far from you, Anya, and I want folks here to know that we have to do it together. And the represented group here, obviously, is just a subset of the support that we're going to provide each other with this work. And our hope is that everyone here and across the school will engage in that work in a meaningful way. So I think, as you mentioned, Anya, the topic of faculty hiring, I think, kind of bridges us nicely to the next recommendation, which is improving senior level search and hiring practices to address diverse leadership. I know it isn't just highlighting faculty recruitment, it's highlighting administrative hires, it's highlighting hiring practices more broadly, right, as a school. And on that, before I open it up, I think I just wanted to provide an example of how we engaged one particular search process here in the dean's office. And I'm not sharing this as a model that folks need to replicate, but just show based on the position and the responsibilities of the role, how we conceive the search process for that position. And this is what ultimately resulted in the hiring of our fantastic CFO, Ellen Herman. But we engaged in a very open and inclusive search process, and depending on the stage of the search, we had an interview panel, as most administrative and staff searches include, but we also provided an opportunity for all of our fund managers or financial analysts to engage with the short list of candidates and give them an opportunity to meet with our finalists as well as our managers. So I wanted folks that engage with the CFO on a regular basis to have the opportunity to provide some input, but with the understanding, based on all the recommendations and feedback, the decision will ultimately rest with us here in the dean's office to hire the best qualified candidate. But that was one process that I felt was very inclusive. It took a lot of time and effort on everybody's part, but just wanted to share that as an example of ways in which we addressed a specific position, how it served the school, and how we wanted to engage an inclusive practice of hiring in there. But I'll open it up to the panelists. Lionel, please.
Yeah, I'll add to that. One of the things that's happening, as we all know, across the country, but also at UCLA, is there's a generational changeover in hiring and in faculty. And our school has been part of that in the last 3 or 4 years. There's been a huge influx of new voices, new faculty, and a wide array of points of view coming to the table. And I think one of the things that's been important about that, and I think this relates to the previous point in terms of advocacy and resources, is promoting a way of thinking of AEDI as not something separate and additional, but as completely interwoven into everything that is a part of how people approach their workplace, how faculty approach their research, how a curriculum is developed. And a couple of our departments have really revised the curriculum in the last few years. And that is an ongoing effort. I'm not suggesting it's finished or done, but I think one of the modes of thinking of it that we've been trying to make sure comes to the fore is it's not, oh yeah, but that it is completely tied into advocacy, hiring, resources, research. Yeah, and that's what I'll say.
I should also mention, just the moment we're in, because we are talking about hiring practices, and we're in a very challenging moment as a school in terms of the many transitions we've had. We've had a lot of colleagues leave us. We were able to hire and refill certain positions, but I know there are a lot of key positions that we have yet been to recruit for, and those positions that we do or have been recruiting for have been challenging as well. So I know we're talking about practices we've taken or were engaged in, but I think we should also recognize the challenges, as it was mentioned in the findings itself, right? The sort of strain it is having on staff particularly, and obviously resonates then in terms of the support we provide students and making sure that they have a rich experience in their work, and also our partnership with faculty as we engage in research and teaching and service. So any other thoughts on this topic? Oh, and I saw in the chat, is everybody okay on the audio, folks being able to hear? Hopefully that's been okay.
I think, Michael, just a final point here on this recommendation, which is the focus it really places on practices as a part of the hiring and career development work that we do across the school. I think it's a really, really terrific thing to tease it out as a separate standing point. And there are challenges on the academic versus the staffing side of things, but what they share and put focus on for all of us is that there's continued work on how we shape the ways in which committees and groups come together as a part of what we really are deeply committed to, which is the idea of very consultative, open and transparent ways of bringing new experiences and new individuals aboard as part of the school. I think it continues to be a learning experience for all of us. And I think one of the things that would be helpful is that we create, again, in a school that is so defined by its breadth and horizontality across a lot of different creative areas and 14 different academic programs, that we find ways to shape a framework that can be shared locally with each of the departments and different kinds of programs and experiences that we bring the hiring of new faculty and staff through.
Yeah, and that reminds me, Brett, what we did, and I know it's a requirement for faculty hiring and applications, is we did ask candidates for the CFO position to mention AEDI, not just mention, but talk about their work in AEDI and their position in AEDI and how they see themselves implementing AEDI practices into their work as CFO. So I think that is something I would highly encourage as we move forward with hopefully ongoing recruitment of various positions across the school. That we put that into our practice, especially with our staff recruitment as well. Anya?
I want to just add one more beat to our conversation about this recommendation, and that is it's tied actually to point number one, recommendation number one. And I believe that communicating the vast work that we're doing in this area is very important for the hiring and retention question, but especially around hiring. People look to, well, what are they up to over there, and looking for places to find that their work will be meaningful in this area, find that their work will be honored relative to their professional goals, and whether student, staff, or faculty. So there's many reasons why all of the recommendations are extremely important, but there's many reasons why the communication piece is so critical, and this, I think, is one of them. I think it's also true relative to development opportunities, et cetera.
Thank you. I'm going to do a quick time check because I see we have about 10 minutes left. Folks that do have questions, please put them in the Q&A. If we can't address your questions here, we will follow it up with a response following this town hall. I do want to still have time for our final recommendation here as part of our discussion, which is an important one here. But if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we will get to those questions. So appreciate everybody's understanding on that. So the next one, which is review and revise school level incident reporting processes and resources.
So one of the things I was thinking a lot about is that, again, I'm entering this conversation at a different point in time than you all. And since I've started the role, I've had an opportunity to have this onboarding process, a lot of listening, deep learning with you, and still more to come. And what's very compelling to me at this point is that much of what I've been hearing is also reflected in the climate report, and this is one of those areas. Even prior to seeing the assessment, a conversation has been started with Chantel, Lionel, and myself about a way to address bias incidents, the reporting of which that we'd like to create something internal. I've proposed an idea to both of them that we've gotten started on that teases out the difference between what would happen for a student that might have a reporting issue versus a staff person and a faculty person. And then ultimately, there will be opportunities to take a look and see what needs to be reflected through that process that's part of the wider campus process versus what is more internal. But one of the things that I'll speak to, for instance, is that this notion that people feel a sense of retribution has already come up in more than one of my conversations. So clearly, this is something that we can work on together. And I think that what I've proposed with Lionel and Chantal and how we develop that out will give us some processes that address this issue. But I would also say that as we tease it out, this is an example for me of something that will be discussed in the council, for instance, that there will be a wider group that'll take a look at the processes and say, well, we need to tweak this or add this. This is how the collaborative part of it strengthens everything that we're intending to do.
Thank you, Anya. Other thoughts, responses to this recommendation?
Just very briefly, Michael, what I wanted to share with everybody in reading through the recommendation is just in addition to review and revise, the word I would add is broadcast. That what we need to be finding, and I think this came out in part in the findings, is for us to think of ways in which we can create roadmaps that explain the processes around reporting such that we can understand how we operate within the school in this larger complex landscape of EDI across campus. And I think that was one of the things that came out in different comments and feedback that we got that I think everybody, in different ways draws attention to, that a level of complexity can be reduced in part by just finding ways to navigate better and understanding, which will not just manage expectations, but provide, I think, also greater information around the kind of resources and framework that's out there already.
Yeah, and along Chantal, I was about to along those lines, I would just want to highlight the work that Chantal's office. I was waiting for Chantal to talk, but I'll just do it. You were subtly not unmuting. Developing of a kind of guide for students of all the resources that are available and printing it out, which is a novelty in this day and age, but also making it available electronically for all students as a kind of quick look resource, and thinking through the multiple ways to make sure that that information is available. But I think the coalescing over the summer that Chantal's office did of that information for students, I think at least gives a place to start, and is massively appreciated. And since she's not going to say it, I thought I'd do it for her.
Well, I'm trying to be mindful of time, but I do want to say, we're hoping to have these kind of resource pages that map out how reporting works internally within School of the Arts and Architecture, and then more broadly within the university's reporting systems, not only for students, but for staff and for faculty as well, because, obviously these issues can affect any of us here in the school's community. And I think what's really helpful about having a resource like this is what I hear from students a lot of the time is you don't really know what you don't know until you're in that situation. And so I really think that by providing this information, not only are we providing empowerment for everyone to be able to voice their concerns, but also more accountability for folks to know that this is something that's taken very seriously. And here's kind of the processes of what's going to happen, should you participate in behavior that is inappropriate.
Thank you, Chantal. I do have a question we did receive in our form with our invitation, but before I get to that, I do want to mention before I forget that we do, with the work we've just done with the climate assessment, the work we've done with the commission, the work we're going to continue to do with our strategic planning, I do want us to build in a regular practice of assessment. And so this climate assessment isn't a one and done. I think as we continue our work and identify new goals and objectives to achieve as a school, we should revisit where we are as a school and continue to build in a practice of assessment. We do that with our academic programming. We do that in so many different ways. We have to do that with the improvement of our climate and community. The question I want to raise to this group relates to the culture here on campus of silos, and where and how we might be able to improve our ability to hold and share space as it relates to serving our students, fulfilling our respective missions as departments and programs and units, but also collectively as a school. And I think that is a important question that is being raised now because of where we're at in terms of where we're all living and working and schedules and things, and we're continuing to have the topic of space come up. But we are now in a moment where we should be looking at space and ownership of that space in a meaningful way. But that was a question that was submitted. I want to raise it to this group in terms of how we might look at the findings of our report and how we address climate in our workplace and educational assessment, and how that might translate into how we view space and our ability to engage across departments and units. As Brett mentioned, how dispersed we are at the beginning of this discussion.
I think one of the most impactful ways that we can address the silo piece has to do with the AEDI work. That by virtue of having some shared goals, work that needs to be done, projects that can be developed, initiatives, all sorts of concepts that still will come out of this work and carrying it forward. The silos get interrupted when we have to come together and connect and work on things, develop things. So it doesn't address necessarily what happens in terms of the physical spaces, or this comment is not meant to address that. But I do believe that the more we craft out where we're headed by virtue of the strategic plan, by virtue of what the plan looks like for the AEDI piece of that plan, et cetera, the more we will break up some of these, some of this distance and very purposefully use make meaning out of what these collective efforts can involve and how those collective efforts can support the AEDI work, as well as whatever goals we set out for ourselves going forward.
Thank you, Anya. And I will say, you know, what we've started to do in the dean's office and in my discussions with some of our managers and our academic program side is where we can start sharing some of our administrative spaces, and specifically on the 8th floor. We want the 8th floor to be more accessible to others that need space to work, especially the areas that overlap and engage with one another. And so we're continuing to assess space on the 8th floor specifically, and I think we whether it's engaging in a broader space inventory way, I think there will be opportunities for us to collaborate across units and departments, and I hope folks will be open to that in terms of the question that was posed.
And I think just
yeah,
a
Brett,
final point there, and building on both of your responses, which I think are terrific. I think everybody wants to embrace and see this next stage of strategic planning itself as a way to embed questions just like that around the balance between silos and larger shared values and aims centrally to that exercise. Without going into the specifics of physical space versus other kinds of space and overlaps that can occur, some of which might be curricular, some of which might be the shared approaches to work around AEDI, some of which might be in the public programs that operate alongside, or even in the research centers that sometimes span across different disciplines in interesting ways. I think what we want to really embrace at the very start is the idea that that strategic planning effort itself ought to be a way of setting questions just like this one around decentralization versus larger shared aims central to that exercise. So just thank you for the question. I think a really terrific one to pose at the outset of this sort of work.
I know we're 2 minutes over, but we did receive one question if the panel's willing to stay on, and I know the session's recorded, so folks will be able to listen in. And for our attendees that have extra minute here, thanks for hanging on. So I'll read the question. Would the school consider pandemic/post-pandemic access issues as part of ADI? Specifically hybrid learning and the impacts of vulnerable students, faculty, and staff.
We've all paused because we want to think which part of the school can answer it. I think I'm going to pause here before saying something. Chantel, you were raising your hand.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that this is a great question, and I think that it's one that most people on campus are asking right now, and especially asking of kind of our higher level university-wide leadership is what are we going to do to support people who had better experiences and more equitable experiences when we did have hybrid learning accessibility, and B, not only that, but how does that kind of allow us to think about what accessibility means and how we can potentially reframe our way of thinking about learning and being online in those different modalities. I think it's going to kind of tie into our communication piece because we are having those conversations. So I think it would be good to share with our school community that we are advocating and telling about the opportunities when we have to advocate. But that is a really larger, not only university-wide question and issue, but also UC-wide question and issue, because it's something that UCOP or the UC Office of the President is also considering and weighing in on as well.
Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to just very quickly add in on, as a first response for the question, which I think is an absolutely brilliant and important one, which is for us to think about ways in which we've learned things over the last 2 or 3 years that we can continue to build on going forward. I think the one point to emphasize here is that it's a question to be posed not just to the leadership of a school, but to a much, much broader set of stakeholders in which the decisions we make as a school are at times in conflict with or working against guidance that's being provided by other entities. And by that, I mean not just a chancellor's office or the president's office of the entire UC system, but also by an academic senate on this campus that in fact is already signaling a belief that this campus and this school ought to be returning to that more traditional form of in-person learning that we find ourselves pushing up against already. And I think part of what we can do within the dean's office especially is just find ways to better communicate and share that larger dynamic for us to think creatively about what we can do best on this front. I think it's absolutely the right question to be asked, particularly because of the ways in which it creates more equitable online and hybrid forms of teaching and learning, not in replacement of other forms of practice, but in addition to, can in fact advance in really brilliant ways forms of equity and access that I think higher education and all kinds have been pushed up against in recent years. So thank you for that question. I think a hugely important one, and one for us to continue going forward.
So thank you everyone. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone signed on. This won't be the last time you hear from us. We will share the recording. There will be more discussions, conversations, updates shared with our community here, but I really appreciate everyone taking time. Thank you, Charles, for your work with us and your support and the findings and recommendations you've shared with us here today. So more to come. I really appreciate everything here today, the discussions, and I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of the fall quarter.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, everybody.